I want to talk about this idea of being tired and wired, which is something that I went through, especially postpartum. And it's this idea of being really depleted of energy, but simultaneously being not able to sleep or not able to rest. So it's a very strange feeling. I experienced it for the first time in my life, really in the past 2 years since being postpartum. So I think a lot of women can relate to that feeling. What's going on in your body when you're wired and you're tired? And what advice do you have for somebody in that situation?
Yes, I think a lot of women postpartum and not postpartum can relate to this. It's the weirdest feeling where you're supposed to be falling asleep, but you just have this burst of energy. I call it sometimes the second wind. Other people also call it the second wind. And frequently it's an imbalance in two major hormones, which is cortisol and progesterone. And a lot of times what happens is cortisol is supposed to spike in the morning, then it gradually goes up, and then it's supposed to start to come down in the afternoon and into the evening. And it's supposed to be pretty low around the time that we're supposed to be going to bed. Just naturally matches our circadian rhythm. What happens in people who are wired and tired is that they actually experience a cortisol spike. And we can even see that in their saliva or urine tests that they do throughout the day, that they actually might even get two peaks in cortisol, one in the morning and then one in the evening, or they'll feel tired and they'll have low cortisol throughout the day, and then they have a spike in the evening or around the bedtime, which is when they're not supposed to be having that spike. So it happens frequently in postpartum. It happens frequently to those whose circadian rhythm is a bit disturbed. Let's say people who work late, have to stay up late, students, high school students, college students, any time in our lives when we're faced with a significant amount of stress and we have to go during the day and we deplete cortisol, followed by a time when we're supposed to relax, we get this spike in cortisol right before we go to bed. And what I generally recommend is trying to do a workout or get your exercise in the morning so that we can match our natural morning production of cortisol so that you have sustained energy during the day. And I have yet to meet a person who, if we just make that shift or if we include exercise during the day period, that they don't feel better. I have yet to meet a person who doesn't feel better after incorporating exercise during the day. They usually sleep better and their energy is better the next day. And of course, there are nutrients that we can incorporate to lower our cortisol levels. Phosphatidylserine is a good one. The caveat with that is, we want to make sure that we know what our cortisol levels are. We want to make sure that if they're normal and we take phosphatidylserine, we don't want to suppress cortisol because then we're going to have other issues. And we also want to test progesterone and see, well, is it suboptimal progesterone? And in a lot of women, whether they're in their 20s or 30s, start to experience perimenopause or postpartum, low progesterone levels, it's a huge factor. And generally incorporating something like Vitax or like wild yam root before bed, some of those phytoprogesterone herbs. You guys have a great product, the seed cycling, right, which has that phytoprogesterone component, especially to support that second half of the cycle, that can help with sleep as well.
Yeah, that's great. I want to talk about cortisol for a minute because typically when people think about cortisol, they think negative things. They're like, oh, cortisol is too high. That means my stress is really high. And you want to, lower your cortisol. But cortisol is really important, actually. And for me specifically, I remember postpartum doing all of my labs and seeing my cortisol. I was having that really beautiful spike in the morning, and then it was flatline. So the rest of the day, it was just really low. And I don't think people think, oh, low cortisol could also be an issue. So can you talk about this really fine balance that we want to have?
Yes, absolutely. We get this idea in our head that something is good or bad in the body, and when in reality, it's just all about balance. I frequently even talk about progesterone as being one of the best hormones for women. We want to keep it in balance. We don't want too much of any hormone. And cortisol has been deemed like this bad guy, just like estrogen, where, most people don't hear about low cortisol. Everyone hears about high stress, high cortisol, and we want to do everything to just suppress that hormone. And like you said, it is so important. It regulates our blood sugar, so we want to have it in optimal levels. Too little cortisol, and this is when people are starting to crave sugar. carbs, something to improve glucose a little bit more instantly because your cortisol levels are suppressed and there's nothing really to activate that release of glucose into the bloodstream. And glucose is also really, I'm sorry, not glucose, but cortisol. Glucose is also really important, but cortisol, it regulates our immune system and our inflammation. And what frequently happens is that when you go through a really stressful life experience, you tend to be on that higher cortisol level side of things. And once you, let's say, take a vacation and you're in relax mode, what happens? Usually people get sick, right? Because all of a sudden now your cortisol levels drop and you have immune dysregulation and you're more likely to get sick. And so that we see that happening really frequently. So cortisol, we want to keep it in balance, just like all other hormones. You know, too much and we can be wired but tired, feeling really anxious. And too little, and we could also just be really exhausted during the day and trying to get our sugar up by reaching it for snacks that we later regret.
I love that. And, one thing I just appreciate about a lot of the content that you do is, it's not about steering away from stress, but building that resiliency to go hard and manage that stress. And that's something I think about a lot because Kay and I are just so passionate about our business and work. It's very much all encompassing. I genuinely love it. But I'm always thinking about, okay, how do I support myself, build that resilience of just like a growing business or, just the modern world that we live in is so much more stressful than years ago. So I'm just curious from your perspective with your own life, because you're an incredible woman, incredible entrepreneur, and the women that you work with, what are some things that you would recommend for someone listening who's like, gosh, I just want to be able to, have a stronger resiliency when it comes to stress so it doesn't shoot my cortisol and impact my overall health?
Yeah, I love that. It took me years to find what works for me
Mm,
and to find how can I manage my stress better? How can I manage my energy? Where do I put the boundaries? What's a priority for me? And I spent a lot of years kind of falling flat on my face because I wouldn't honor those things. And I finally learned like I have to honor, I have to meet my body where it's at, and I have to understand what are my deal breakers and what are my priorities. So if I were to break it down, I don't compromise on sleep, my diet, my exercise. So those three things, those are the things that I abide by. So when it comes to my sleep, I've figured out for myself over time that I need to have at least from 10 p.m. to 6 a.m. That's my sweet spot. It could be even better if I could sleep in until 7, but with a 6-year-old, you have to be kind of reasonable. So I usually say with my sleep, it's 10 to 6. And my exercise is really important to me as well. So that's the things I could never just work and not make time to move my body. Even before I hopped on this podcast, I went for like a 20-minute walk. I did a 10-minute yoga session because I worked out in the morning. Then I had a few calls with my patients, and my body's used to moving around. I grew up as an athlete, so movement, exercise, it's really important to me. So I would even encourage a lot of people who are listening to this podcast, what are some ways that you can build more movement into your life? Because we live a really sedentary life, and that can cause extra tension and anxiety and affect our insulin levels and glucose metabolism. So if we even want to have better sleep, we have to build in that extra movement during the day. So not to just get caught up, oh, I did my workout for the day. Did you walk? Did you stretch? Did you
yeah.
take a bath just to get the lymph system going? So sleep, exercise, and every time I deviate, if I'm like, no, I'm just going to work one more hour and go to bed at 11, or no, I really want to set up this new page on my website, it always bites me in the butt the next day. And I'm always like, why did I do that? Why did I deviate from the plan? Don't deviate from the plan. And life happens. It's, I'll go to a conference and I'll stay up a little bit later, but I'm usually not like go, go, go the next day. We have to be kind of smart about when we deviate from the plan. And then when it comes to my diet, I made a commitment many years ago, probably now 2 decades, that just processed sugar, excess alcohol, excess caffeine, processed foods in general are something that do not resonate with my body. And I may have them in small amounts every once in a while because I'm human and I want to enjoy life. but it is not something that is part of my day-to-day experience. And so to build resilience, we have to make sure that we're also supporting the body. If
Yeah.
we're asking the body and our mind to do things day in and day out, whether we're building a business or we want to be a badass parent or, be a great physician, then we have to fuel as such, right? We have to treat our body like that temple, like we want it to be. So those are the things that I preach, I practice in my own life, is optimizing sleep, optimizing performance through exercise, both mental and physical, as well as, making sure that it's whole foods. I eat mostly Whole30 paleo style, but I call it more of a modified version because I enjoy grains every once in a while, and I love my cup of coffee and chocolate sometimes. So it's easy to follow. And of course, I can mention some of the supplements that I really love that have helped me along the way. But it's like, unless you get that foundation, you don't even need to mess with the supplements.
Absolutely. Yeah, I love that. I want to pivot to talking about hormonal imbalances because you mentioned anxiety. And I think that something that happens frequently in this modern stressed out world is that people are exhibiting symptoms of anxiety, depression, maybe ADHD, things that they feel are brain symptoms, but not knowing that there might be a connection to their hormones, specifically a lot of women in different stages of their lives. So, what's the connection between hormonal imbalances and brain symptoms?
Such a great question. And I wish more people would look at any mood or mental disorders through the lens of a hormonal imbalance. Because so many times, this is a woman's journey, and this is a journey that I went through, probably every woman has gone through. You schedule an appointment with your primary care physician because you're having anxiety or you're experiencing PMS or PMDD symptoms leading 1 to 2 weeks before your cycle. It's a 15-minute, if it's that, maybe it's more like a 5-minute conversation with your primary care physician. Here's some birth control, or here's an anti-anxiety or anti-depression medication. And that is the journey that most women go through for all of their symptoms, including mental or mood disorders. Whereas if we look at it from a perspective of hormones, a lot of symptoms like ADD, ADHD, anxiety, and depression can be linked back to some sort of underlying hormone imbalance. And I'm not saying no to these medications. If you guys look at my content, I'm very balanced. I don't think that we can solve things 100% always naturally, but we should always try to do the least invasive, the minimally invasive route first, and try to do no harm by trying the more natural, the better route first, and then use medications as necessary. But symptoms, let's just give a few examples. Symptoms of ADD and ADHD. A lot of times women will feel like they have brain fog, they have trouble focusing, they have fatigue, and they also have sugar cravings because they feel tired. So when they go to a psychiatrist and, okay, you have a trouble focusing, you're feeling overwhelmed because you can't focus, that causes anxiety, ADD, ADHD, here's some Vyvanse or some Adderall. And all of their symptoms don't necessarily go away. Let's say they might have a little better focus, a little bit more energy. Who wouldn't? If you pump a bunch of dopamine and epinephrine through the system, I would have more energy as well. But they still can have symptoms like fatigue, hair loss could still be happening, dry skin, metabolic issues. So it's not necessarily addressing the root cause of what they're feeling. So ADD, ADHD frequently gets mixed up with hypothyroidism. And for a lot of women, oh my goodness, if we just balance progesterone, for a lot of women, a lot of their anxiety symptoms would settle down. And the reason for that is progesterone affects the GABA receptors in the brain. And I was listening to this podcast once, and there's a couple MDs talking about progesterone, and one asks the other, like, well, what's the mechanism? Why do women feel more calm on progesterone? And I was like, I know the answer, but I can't speak because I'm not on the podcast. But it is because progesterone gets metabolized into a GABA agonist. And that is why women, when they have low progesterone levels, they experience PMS, they experience PMDD, They don't need an anti-anxiety medication. They don't need birth control to control their mood. They just need to optimize those progesterone receptors, whether we do it naturally through phytoprogesterone herbals or supplements, or implement bioidentical progesterone into the mix. And testosterone is really important for women. So when women feel depressed, most likely their testosterone is on the lower end. So instead of putting them on antidepressant medication, we need to optimize their testosterone levels so they can feel confident, motivated, and not so depressed. So I think when it comes to mood disorders, I've probably convinced our listeners that it's so important to consider hormone imbalances as potential culprits.
I love that. I think a lot of women don't even understand what a hormonal imbalance is, because so many symptoms, even outside of the mood aspects or PMS that we talked about, is so normal. So I know this is probably a very basic question, but I still think a lot of women are confused. What are maybe a few other surprising things that you've seen in your practice that are considered hormonal imbalances that maybe, women are just living with day to day?
Yeah, absolutely. It's so funny as I'm thinking about this when you're asking this question. I could probably go down the whole alphabet and list
Yeah.
off symptoms per letter, and then some. But some of the less common, or maybe ones that women don't really think about, include GERD, so acid reflux. And in fact, a lot of thyroid conditions like low thyroid or suboptimal thyroid function is linked to low acid production. And so a lot of people think that, well, if I have acid reflux, that probably means that I have that probably means that it's high stomach acid, that I have too much, and they get put on PPIs, where in reality, a lot of studies show that actually people with GERD have stomach acid underproduction. And when we improve thyroid levels, now we're able to get back to normal or regular stomach acid production. So GERD is one of the symptoms. Also, digestive issues, so constipation, diarrhea, also frequently associated with thyroid. So if you have too much thyroid hormone, such as with hyperthyroidism, you could have diarrhea. If you have too little of the thyroid hormone, then you can experience constipation, which can then lead to bloating and gas and even SIBO as well. Some other really uncommon, I was going to say common to me, but uncommon to a lot of women struggling with this, is I would say even cardiovascular changes. So changes in heart rate and rhythm. So I see a lot of women perimenopausal, menopausal starting to experience arrhythmias or changes in heart rate. And that can also be linked back to the thyroid hormone. So a lot of women will be scared to start on the thyroid hormone because they think it'll just speed up their heart rate. And I'll say, no, actually, if we incorporate the thyroid hormone, then it'll regulate your metabolism and your metabolic rate. And that includes your heart rate as well. And the other two really uncommon symptoms that I think people don't think about are frequency in getting cold or colds or getting sick. So this is when, someone sneezes and they're like 20 rows ahead of you and you're the person that gets the cold. Or the women who say leading up to their cycle, they feel body aches as if they're going to get sick. So, or, you're the one that always catches the cold in your house. Everyone else is fine, but you happen to be the person who always gets sick. So just frequency and how increasing frequency of getting colds or flus and all those things, infections. And lastly, one symptom that I would ask women to pay attention to is trouble gaining lean muscle mass. And this frequently happens as we get older, but it is a really big sign that our hormones are out of whack. So if you're exercising, you're eating a lot of protein during the day, but it looks like you're not building muscle and gaining more fat, then it's a sign of a hormone imbalance.
Wow. So everybody should be looking into hormonal imbalances is basically the bottom line. But I have a lot of women in my life who are going through perimenopause or suspect that they are, and they've started to experience some of the symptoms that you're mentioning. And a big one that I hear is I wake up in the middle of the night. I have to pee frequently. I can't get back to sleep. My sleep is just not the same. I just feel like I'm gaining weight all of a sudden. And I encourage them to get their hormones tested. And then I want to talk to them about bioidentical hormones because this could be an option for them. So, what are bioidentical hormones versus synthetic hormones, and who are they a good fit for?
Yeah, that's a great question. And I think there's so much confusion on this topic. It's going to take a long time for us to all get on the same page. And I don't know if we ever will. But I think the Women's Health Initiative pretty much ruined hormone replacement therapy for a lot of women. And so it's taking time to help women understand what's the difference between synthetic hormones, bioidentical hormones, and how can we advocate for ourselves and make sure that we're getting prescribed the right hormones, but also the right combination of hormones. So the main difference between synthetic hormones and bioidentical hormones is in their chemistry. Bioidentical hormones, they are created to mimic our own biological hormone. So when we apply it, take it orally, or have it as a pellet, whatever form, it is seen by the body as its own. So it's not there to create chaos. We're simply increasing levels technically of our own natural hormone. So synthetic hormones are slightly different in their chemical structure, and they come with a lot of negative side effects. So just to compare and contrast, estradiol in bioidentical form, so BHRT, estradiol reduces the risk of blood clots, whereas synthetic estrogen, such as found in oral contraceptive pills, right, it can increase the risk of blood clots and cancer, and the list goes on and on of negative side effects. With bioidentical hormones and their implementation, we actually see a reduction in cardiovascular disease, reduced risk of neurodegenerative disease, and cognitive decline. We also see a reduction in breast cancer or risk of getting breast cancer and a host of other cancers. And I just even want to mention the fact that a lot of people get scared of, or a lot of women are scared of cancer and hormone replacement. The risk of not being on hormone replacement then predisposes you for greater risk of cardiovascular disease. And it's not cancer, but it's cardiovascular disease and heart disease that is the number one killer for women. And even if you go on the American Heart Association website and you read about the research behind estradiol, you'll actually be surprised at the impact that estradiol has on our hearts and the health of our hearts. And so I think it becomes really important to just rethink how we look at hormone replacement, and that bioidenticals are very different in their function. They almost have the opposite function of synthetic hormones and have so many benefits on all different systems in the female body. And how I would approach it is make sure that when your provider starts you on hormone replacement, always clarify, is this bioidentical? And if it's bioidentical, let's say, yeah, it's estradiol, it's bioidentical, that it's offset by progesterone as well. We have to have those checks and balances when it comes to hormone replacement, even when they're bioidentical.
And so somebody could go to a conventional practitioner, and this is something I don't know, and they could be prescribed bioidentical hormones. Is that right?
Absolutely. Yeah. You don't need to work with an ND or a DO or a functional medical doctor. You can always ask your primary care physician or your OBGYN or your endocrinologist if this is something that they're open to. The likelihood that they will is still very small because it's taking time for all of us to get on the same page of not only we should only be prescribing bioidentical hormone replacement, but we should also prescribe estradiol with progesterone to combat its negative side effects, because progesterone, it keeps estrogen in check. Estrogen likes for things to grow. Progesterone keeps that growth at bay. And even though a woman's estradiol may be on the lower end, if we just plump her up with estradiol and have nothing to offset that, we're just causing trouble, not intentionally, but there's so many ways to just reduce our risk for getting cancer. And I would say the following: you kind of have to go through the interview process of your provider. If you love your primary care physician or any other healthcare provider, but you're in the stage of life where now you may be considering hormone replacement for whatever reason. Maybe you're postpartum and your mood is suffering. Maybe you're in perimenopause and you are like, I'm not sleeping, my anxiety's through the roof, I'm losing hair, my skin sucks. It's like low progesterone, low progesterone, low progesterone. And you want to have that conversation with your healthcare provider. Ask them what their experience is with hormone replacement. Are they open to testing your levels? If the levels come up suboptimal, do they even know what optimal levels are? Or are they just looking kind of at the range? Because, you know, it may come back normal, but it could be suboptimal. And then also, if they are going to treat you for, let's say, suboptimal progesterone levels, what are they going to prescribe? Because we'd want to make sure that we get prescribed the bioidentical versus and not the synthetic. And don't be disheartened. One of the things that I want our listeners to know is there are so many providers, again, whether they're MD, ND, DO, it doesn't matter, NP, who would be happy to work with you and who you can find, who would do the right thing and prescribe the right hormones and do all the testing. There's a small percentage of conventional providers. Again, we're still catching up with the data and the research. They are, not us, but they are. And so it can take a little bit more time to find that provider who's maybe in your network, who you can use your insurance with. But don't be disheartened if that provider, does not take that holistic approach. There are many other providers that you just need to interview who would be happy to work with you.
That's really great advice. And I'd also love for you to touch on testosterone, which you talked about earlier. But we work with a lot of women who feel my testosterone is very high. I have symptoms of PCOS, but not recognizing that testosterone is also really important for women. So I would love for you to talk about that.
Yes. If I had a penny for every time I heard that, oh, my physician put me on spironolactone because my testosterone levels were too high. And when I would look at the testosterone levels, let's say they're 35 or 45, I'm like, that's not high. That's actually, we could even get it a little bit higher if we really wanted to. And that's so unfortunate. And when it even comes to PCOS, majority of the time it's actually a progesterone to estrogen imbalance. And so, but frequently testosterone is seen as the bad guy here. So testosterone for women, it is so important. I feel like it is the hormone that really gives us that superpower. And in terms of even blood level concentration, we have more testosterone compared to even estrogen, which is kind of crazy, but this is why women, we are able to do the things that we can to feel motivated, to feel sexy, to feel confident. Testosterone is so important for us. And then especially also for bone density and muscle mass as well. And building muscle mass as we age is so critical, and supporting healthy testosterone levels as we age is also very important. If you think about it, a lot of our hormones, they start to decline after the age of 24. So there's this really small window when we're like, we're feeling great. And it's usually after college when adulthood hits. It's like, no, we don't feel so great, paired with, hormone imbalance and those declining hormone levels. So testosterone is what gives women that superpower. And I don't believe that we need to be putting women on spironolactone to lower testosterone. I think it's okay to be on spironolactone to offset some of the aromatase activity. So aromatase enzyme can contribute to symptoms like acne and excess hair growth. So if other things don't work, if natural methods don't work, like seed cycling and a little bit of saw palmetto and working on the gut, if those things don't work, if you're doing all the right things, then a little bit of spironolactone can help, but not in the significant amounts that they're being prescribed.
You mentioned something that is fascinating to me. I had no idea that after the age of 24 that our hormones naturally dip. What I've been seeing just with our customers at BIA and friends and people I know, we have a lot of women like in their 30s who are getting these more menopausal symptoms. So their hormones are dipping even earlier. So I'm curious, outside of age, like what might be causing this, epidemic of women dealing with lower hormonal imbalances when they're still, not in their 40s or 50s?
I think for one, we're more aware. So we're more aware of the hormone imbalances, and there's a lot more research, there's a lot more data. Women are talking about this more. And I
Mm.
think just having a greater conversation and awareness is now shedding light that it's not just women in their 40s and 50s that used to get the attention when it comes to hormone imbalances. It is actually women are starting to experience these hormone imbalances, and men too, by the way. Low testosterone in early 30s is not
Mm.
uncommon for men, and even in their late 20s. But it's, I think, just because we're shedding more light on the hormone imbalances, what they are, and so we know that just women can experience these fluctuations at a younger age. We don't have to wait until we're 40s or 50s. However, we also have to consider that the environment that we live in is very different compared to the environment that we lived in 50 or 100 years ago. There's a lot of endocrine disruptors and endocrine mimicking chemicals and endocrine disruptors that block hormonal receptors on cells. So whether it's heavy metal toxicity or pesticide, herbicide exposure, or mold toxicity, or the foods that we eat that are highly processed that then affect the microbiome, which in turn affects our genetics, which in turn affects our hormones and our immune system. Those are a lot of major factors that I see can impact women and when they're starting to experience symptoms. Stress as well. And then if you top stress with birth control, that of course is a double whammy. And with birth control, we're suppressing our ovarian function, we're suppressing our ovaries and estrogen and progesterone levels. So of course we're going to start to see more hormone-like symptoms earlier in life.
So I mean, you're literally talking about me back in the day, like someone who is living in stress, who is on birth control. I finally get off, my hormones are out of whack, which really opened my own wellness journey and, a big component of why we started BS. So hopefully I'm an example of lifestyle, nutritional changes. Everything that you're recommending can really play a huge part. But I'm curious, now that I'm on the other side, if anyone's on birth control right now, they're thinking about coming off, are there any supplements or anything that you recommend that they can really implement to kind of make that transition a little bit more seamless?
Yeah, absolutely. I think, first of all, before you come off of birth control, have a plan, right?
Mm.
So, birth control has its purpose, it's just been misused. And it shouldn't be for painful cycles, heavy cycles, mood disorders. It's meant to be for birth control. And there's a time and a place for it. And I just want to caution women who are coming off of birth control to do it in a smart way and have a plan, right? Because otherwise, we talked about stress. There's going to be other stressors in life
Yes.
that we want to avoid. They're blessings, but also stressors at the same time. So that's number one. The second thing is get a hormone baseline. Don't
Mm.
just come off of birth control. You have to make sure that you understand, are you even being on birth control, and whether it's an IUD, a hormonal IUD, or OCP, you could be still on a little bit more on the estrogen dominant side. So before you start messing with herbs and supplements, you want to know what your estrogen levels are, what your progesterone levels are, thyroid, cortisol, DHEA, testosterone. You want to make sure that you know what those levels are so you know which levers do you need to pull or push. And one of the most important things to do if you do decide to make that move is make sure that you're on a good multivitamin. And even if you're not coming off of birth control, you need to be on a good multivitamin, because we just know that it depletes so many of our key nutrients. So you want to make sure that you're in a good multivitamin, preferably a prenatal with iron or without iron, depending on if you're having a menstrual cycle or not. If you're on a birth control that presses your menstrual cycle, you probably don't need an iron containing supplement. Your ferritin is probably already through the roof. But if you are having a regular cycle on birth control, that you might benefit from a prenatal that has a little bit of iron in it. I would also recommend starting on like a phytoprogesterone herbal supplement. So this is something that could have a little bit of Vitex, a little bit of wild yam in it, maybe even some black cohosh. And why am I suggesting phytoestrogen herbs? It's because if you are a little bit on the estrogen dominant side, sometimes incorporating some phytoestrogens can block our own estrogen activity. And phytoestrogens, even like soy, are naturally weaker than our own estradiol. So there'll be a little bit of competition. And so it can offset those estrogen dominant like symptoms. But incorporating some of those phytoprogesterone or phytoestrogen herbs can stimulate those hormone receptors as if you have those hormones available. So if you've been suppressing your own hormone production through birth control, then incorporating some of those herbs can help you get back on track faster.
Wow, those are great tips and so fascinating. I asked a group of women who are going through perimenopause, some of my friends, for some questions. I told them we were going to be chatting with you today. So, one question that they had was about the bioidentical hormones, which we chatted about. And another question that came up is why the transition into perimenopause and menopause can push them down the inflammatory cascade. So, why does this happen and how can we prevent it?
I see this happen so frequently. In fact, I went through this in my own health journey, and perimenopause started for me a little bit earlier. It actually happened for me postpartum, and I couldn't quite fix it naturally. And for someone like myself, looking back even at my own personal history, I wish someone would give me bioidentical progesterone like in my 20s. It would just really help me out so much. But it took me medical school, to get to that point where I could just give it to myself without needing permission from anyone else. But I experienced my own hormonal fluctuations postpartum that led me to experience rheumatoid arthritis. And I was experiencing a flare for a pretty long time. And I did everything that we've talked about: diet change, exercise, sleep, stress management. I mean, I'm a naturopath. I know these foundational pieces and how to live and execute on them. And it just, nothing was working. I was still experiencing flares. I could not even unfold my fingers when I was sleeping. I was in so much pain. And I finally just threw in the towel. I said, screw this. I'm 32. I'm starting on bioidentical progesterone. And it was a game changer for me and for my autoimmune symptoms. I went from losing hair to gaining hair, from experiencing joint pain to no joint pain, from painful, crippling cramping to no cramping, heavy bleeding to normal cycle in a month. And what happens postpartum is similar to what happens to women in perimenopause and menopause, and that is a dip in hormones. And predominantly, initially when we experience the dip, most often estrogen stays pretty high, but progesterone is the one that tanks. And progesterone, if you look at the research behind it, it's actually being explored right now as an immune modulator drug in treatment for autoimmune conditions.
Wow.
And progesterone, it affects our immune system by inhibiting prostaglandin synthesis. And when we inhibit prostaglandin synthesis, it's our way to turn off that inflammatory cycle in the body so that we experience less pain and less likelihood of developing autoimmune conditions. So for women who are prone to autoimmune conditions or who are experiencing, let's say, joint pain or hair loss or just body ache sensation, progesterone is really important to make sure that it is balanced.
Wow, I had no idea the power of progesterone. I knew it was an important hormone, but that is just so incredible. I'm going to pivot a little bit. And actually, this was something I was talking about with Kea before you joined because my mind was blown. You mentioned thyroid a couple of times throughout this interview and how, stress can deplete the adrenals and thyroid can be one aspect. And you were mentioning some metrics of like what your thyroid levels should be, which I'd love for you to share. And I realized mine was, my doctor is like, there was no red flag. But after hearing you, I'm like, oh, I'm actually suboptimal. So if you can maybe talk about, the levels of thyroid and how women should be thinking about it, because I thought it was very fascinating and I'm in this world. So,
and maybe you can tell me what your levels are.
Yeah.
Not that I'm supposed to be treating you on this podcast, but we can use your levels as an example. I could walk you through it. So a lot of providers will only test the TSH or a TSH with a reflex to T4. And when you do that, you're only getting the tip of the iceberg of what's really going on with a thyroid gland. So the TSH usually goes up when there's not enough thyroid and goes down when there's, let's say, enough thyroid or more than enough of a thyroid hormone circulating. And
Mhm.
both T4 and T3 levels affect TSH. So we have this built-in feedback loop in our body. And we know, even from research, that optimal TSH levels are below 2.2, and even better if they're around 1 or 1.1. And what's
Mhm.
fascinating is that a lot of fertility clinics know this, and they apply this to women who are trying to get pregnant. But after pregnancy, it's null and void. It's as if women don't need the thyroid hormone anymore. It's only like to reproduce, and that's it. And after that, you're off the thyroid hormone. So TSH, we want it to be at least below 2.2, and better if it's around 1 or 1.1.
Mhm.
I'm not attached to the TSH because some women, if we start them on thyroid hormone, if they're not used to having so much thyroid hormone, their TSH, they might feel more comfortable with a higher TSH. Some women, once you start them on the thyroid hormone, you can see their TSH drop, but they still need more given their symptoms and how they're feeling. So the TSH ideally is okay to be a little bit on the lower side. You just always want to be also testing T4 and T3. So this whole
Mhm.
principle of TSH with reflex to T4 testing it doesn't give you any information, because you could have a suboptimal TSH, so then you don't even test your T4 levels, or you could test your T4 levels, but then you're not testing the conversion of T4 to T3. And
Mhm.
T3, our T3 hormone, is 4 to 5 times more potent than T4. And your cells will always prefer T3 over T4. It's just our cells know that they're going to get more benefit from something that's 5 times more active than something that's not. And where I see women feel their best is if their T4, their free T4 is at 1.2 or above, or their
Mhm.
T3 at least 3.3 or above. And not that there isn't a cutoff range for T3 or for T4. Of course there is, because you get to a point where you're going to start having hyperthyroid like symptoms. But usually if the T4 is around 1.4, 1.6, or even if at least it's between 1.2 to 1.4, and T3, free T3, is between even a 3 and like a 3.5 or 3.6, most women will feel better. Their body temperature will be better. Their sleep will be better. They'll have fewer food cravings. One of my newer patients, we put her on a thyroid medication. She's a woman in menopause, just natural was not an option. And one of the first things that she reported to me, not only was her energy better and she could work out better and more, but her sugar cravings went away.
Mm.
And that's just with like a little bit of tweaking of her thyroid hormone. So when it comes to thyroid, we need to look at the TSH, which is part of the feedback loop. We also need to look
Mhm.
at our T4, T3 levels, as well as autoimmunity. So we want to know, are our levels suboptimal because of a potential immune disorder where our thyroid is getting attacked, or the enzymes that convert T4 to T3 are getting attacked?
So fascinating. I just pulled up my labs when you were talking, just if it's
Okay.
interesting for anyone,
Okay, let's do this.
I share
Tell
everything so
us.
people know. I know. And this was recently. So let's see. So my T4 is 1.39. My TSH is 1.16. So there's two T3s. I see a T3 free, which is 2.8, and then my T3 is 82. I don't know what that is.
Yeah, so we want to look at the free T3, and you're at 2.8. So right there, I can tell you that there's a conversion issue, because you've got your brain is registering that there's enough T4. So it's
Mhm.
not telling you to produce more thyroid hormone, and you have really good T4 levels, because I said, right, 1.2 or above is healthy, but your free T3 is kind of tanked,
Mhm.
right? And so this is where we would want to incorporate nutrients like iodine and selenium and seaweed to help improve that conversion and make sure that iron levels are healthy, because those are the things that improve the conversion from T4 to T3. And I assume that there isn't like an autoimmunity or an autoimmune component. You don't have peroxidase antibodies or thyroglobulin antibodies.
I don't
Did they
think
test you for that?
for that one, but from what I remember from your last one, Yasmin, I don't think there was.
Got it. But maybe it's worth
Yeah,
checking.
so if you, that's one of the things that I would want to know. Why does someone have a conversion issue and of T4 to T3? It could be an autoimmune component. So if your body is attacking the enzyme that converts T4 to T3, it could be a nutrient deficiency or suboptimal levels, again, of iodine or selenium or iron. Those are the big ones.
Okay.
And it could also just be, that you're a poor converter of T4 to T3. So those are and sometimes people will fight me on this. They're like, no, my gland is supposed to be perfect and I can take seaweed and I can fix it. And I'm like, I see it not work. You could be, doing all the right things. I was doing all the right things and I still could not get my hormones to be where they needed to be. And we're not born with perfect glands. Sometimes we just have to go with the genetics that we're given. And if you're not a good converter of T4 to T3, thank God for a little bit of T3 medication, right? Like it can make a big difference.
That was so fun. We should do this more often.
I know, seriously, because Kate and I always talk about our labs. Yeah.
By the way, so funny. I pulled mine up too, because I'm sure everybody who's listening to this was like, I'm gonna pull mine up just to see. Not that Dr. Elena is giving medical advice. We're putting that disclaimer out there, but it's still fun. Yasmin, we have the exact same numbers.
No, are you serious?
Thyroid. You were saying them and I was like, is she looking at mine? Like, what's happening? But literally the exact same number, 1.2, 2.8, like crazy. But that was really cool to go through.
Interesting.
Did you guys was it a finger prick or was it actually a blood draw, a serum test?
Blood.
Yeah, you did a blood draw.
Blood draw. Mm-hmm.
It was a blood draw. Okay, because this is a really great clarification. You want to do a blood draw. So we can even just kind of take a little sidetrack and talk about testing. There's no perfect test. There are limitations with blood draws, and there are limitations with urine testing, and there are limitations with finger prick testing. The biggest limitation with finger prick testing is that you cannot get a big enough sample to test what's really going on. And so I try to avoid those tests. They're super convenient, but they're super unreliable. And that's why I wanted to clarify. It's, are we working with the right numbers here, depending on how the test was performed? If you want to do a blood test, that's the gold standard for testing hormones, because we can test total and we can test free hormone levels as well. The drawback of testing using the blood draw method is that we can't test estrogen metabolites. And that's where urine testing is useful. I don't use urine testing for treating people in terms of even dosing hormonal medications, but I will use it to look at cortisol levels, because that's another drawback of blood testing, is that we can't see what the cortisol curve is doing, right? Because it's just a one snapshot in time. But the benefit with the urine testing is we can actually map out cortisol and also map out those estrogen metabolites and see, are they pro-inflammatory or anti-inflammatory. So, and always test in the morning before 9 a.m. fasting. Our hormones tend to peak between 8 to 10 a.m. in the morning. So if you do any sort of testing in the afternoon, it's not very reliable data. I want to see when you wake up, what are your hormones doing? Because your body's resting during the night. That's when your growth hormone is peaking. That's when thyroid, that's when all the other hormones are getting produced, and naturally they're going to peak earlier in the night, or I should say later in the night, early morning. So we want to catch it as early as possible. And when it comes to saliva testing, way too many fluctuations and variables. That one is hard to convince me to test.
Very interesting and such good advice. Well, I know we're running up on time, but you talked a lot about exercise, you talked about sleep, you talked about nutrition. I want to talk about maybe some things that you're like, I would not do this to my body. This is going to mess with my hormones. We never want to say never, but what are some things that you would never do to your body?
I think I already said no to synthetic hormones. So absolutely no synthetic hormones if you can avoid them at all. It's interesting. Women will be okay women will be anti-hormones, but they're okay with drinking alcohol. And that to me doesn't make sense because alcohol is so pro-inflammatory and increases your risk of getting cancer, obviously more than hormone replacement does, because I just mentioned that hormone replacement Bioidentical is actually cancer protective. So what I wouldn't do is I wouldn't yo-yo diet. So I wouldn't put myself through hypo and then hyper caloric intake. I wouldn't do that to my body. I want to find, for whatever stage of life I'm in, what diet works for me. So a lot of women, what I recommend as you're transitioning from different phases of your life, pay attention to your metabolism, pay attention to your glucose, to your insulin, to your hormones, because you need to eat for that phase of life that you're in. When we're younger, we can get away with a little bit of a higher carbohydrate diet, especially if we're really active. But as our metabolism changes, we really need to change our diet to incorporate more healthy fats, incorporate more healthy protein, and fewer carbs. An average American nowadays eats about 300 grams of carbohydrates. That's rocket fuel that is not getting used up. So I frequently, compare carbs to rocket fuel. It's like, well, the rocket uses the rocket fuel, but we don't. So that just gets stored as fat for us. And so it's really important to not do crazy dieting, find what works, stick with it, deviate, but don't do a sharp, U-turn, because that causes additional stress on the body. And I also, when it comes to exercise, because exercise can be a good stressor, but it can also be a bad stressor, is I would not over exercise. I try to shift women away from doing excessive amounts of cardio and shift them more to resistance training and bursts of cardio. It's okay to go on an endurance run or to go on your favorite 10-mile run, but don't do that. Don't make that your workout throughout the week. We want to build strength. We want to build lean muscle mass. That's longevity. Whereas excessive cardiovascular workouts, they can deplete your adrenals, contribute to muscle breakdown or muscle wasting. And so we want to focus on the things that can rebuild us from within. What else would I want to do? So no yo-yo dieting, no ups and downs, no extremes in exercise, or limit the extremes. And of course, I know this is common sense, but don't drink tap water. I don't know why I still need to say that nowadays, but the amount of crap that's found in our tap water, from herbicides, pesticides, birth control, medications, heavy metals, I still see people they don't need to be drinking tap water. They're drinking tap water. And it's one of the things that I always ask even my clients is like, what's the quality of your water? Or they're drinking distilled water that's stripped of everything. And so we want to make sure that we stay hydrated. That's actually another thing I would say is make sure that you're also drinking good water, get your electrolytes in. Minerals make the world go round, and avoid those unnecessary pollutants if possible.
I love this. Elena, what a practical interview. I feel like I left this with so many takeaways, so I know our audience is going to love it, but it was such an honor having you join us. Thank you for sharing your wisdom. That was so, so much fun.
Thank you so much. I had a blast with you guys.